Is this thing on? Oh, it's on. Let's make a book together. First, I collected a bunch of paper that was laying around my house and getting on my nerves, and I cut it into bookish proportions, a little longer than it is tall, because you're folding it in half with either a teflon or a bone folder. I usually fold the sheets in groups of 2 and then group them into groups of 4 to create signatures later on. And I go over the fold a couple times with the teflon folder to make sure all of the signatures are laying really flat in the end. Here I've just folded all the pages, and now I'm sectioning them off, as I said, into groups of 4 each to create signatures. After combining all the pages into groups of 4 to make the signatures, I go over each signature a couple more times with the bone folder. Now we're going to want to poke our holes for the sewing. Here I'm creating a template for myself. I cut a strip of cardstock, marked the length of the book, and folded it a bunch of times to find the even spacing between my holes. I only use this method for the first signature because after that I can use a page from that signature to guide the holes for all the rest of the signatures. Start sewing your first signature by going in from the outside, then winding back and forth until you come out at the other end. Then place your second signature on top and repeat the process until you've sewn through 2 signatures. Tie a double knot at the first hole of the first signature and the last hole of the second signature to connect the 2 together. This is not a tutorial, so I don't go deeper into it, but if you're interested, I'm using a French link stitching method, which involves looping through the previous sewing as you continue sewing the next signature. This method creates a nice crisscrossing in the stitching on the spine of the text block. Once you end your third signature, you'll need to create a kettle stitch at the very end. This is basically looping through the previous signature and tying your new signature to the text block. To tighten the knot, I pull out and then up, thereby creating the kettle stitch's characteristic spiral pattern. Is this too technical? It feels too technical. Anyway, once you're done stitching all the signatures together, you're basically creating 2 kettle stitches, one on top of the other, to end the sewing. First, you tie off your last signature to the previous one, and then to the one below that. Pull tight to fasten the knot, and cut the excess thread. Now we're done with the text block. Next, we're going to use some PVA or any other white glue, including Elmer's glue, to adhere the spine of the book. This will prepare the text block for the next step of the process, sewing the end bands. To do this, I'll be using a needle, some embroidery thread, and some twine that I found. The twine is a little bit fuzzier than I want it to be, so I'm cutting off sections that I want and covering them with a little bit of glue to hold down those threads that are sticking out. This will make my end bands look neater later on. Now I'm cutting 2 colors of embroidery thread to about the length of my forearm. This is longer than what you would need for one end band, but I'm going to use the same thread for both end bands. Tie the 2 threads into a knot on one end, and cut off any excess thread. And we're gonna skip over me struggling to thread a needle. Start sewing the end bands at the center of your first signature. To do this, I poke the needle through the first kettle stitch, wrap around the top of the book, and into the first kettle stitch again. I insert the twine that I prepared earlier into the loop that I create with my embroidery thread. Sewing the rest of the end band is basically looping under and around the support structure, which is my twine, then crossing over your first piece of embroidery thread with your second piece, looping under and around again, and repeating the whole process. Every time you switch back to your original color of thread, you'll secure the end band to the text block by looping through the kettle stitch of the next signature. The hardest part about sewing an end band is just starting it, because whatever you're using as a support structure isn't properly connected to the text block just yet. As you progress in your sewing, you're tying your support structure to the text block, and the further you get, the stronger you make that connection. Obviously, you'll want to sew an end band on both sides of your book. But after sewing your first end band, one thread will be shorter than the other because you've used it to loop through the text block. Because I'm using the same thread for both of my end bands, I'm just going to switch the color of the dominant thread that I'm using. And by dominant thread, I mean the thread that's looping back into the text block to secure the end band. Once you've finished sewing the end bands, pull both of the threads to the outside of the text block and secure them in place with a double knot. Now I'm going to cut off the excess twine and dab the end bands with a bit of glue just so everything stays in place. Next, I want to protect all the sewing that I just did, both of the text block and of the end band. Here I'm measuring the length and width of a scrap of paper against the spine of the book. Then I cut it using a ruler and an X-Acto knife, and paste it down with some more white glue. I use my bone folder to really get that paper down to the spine. It's not going to lay perfectly flat, but as long as it's boned down really well, we're good to go. The next part is adding super cloth, but I don't have any of that, so we're going to use these seam protectors, which aren't made for this, but that's okay. The real goal here is to add some fabric that'll strengthen the connection between the text block and the covers. Next, we're going to measure the cover boards. Here I'm using Davy board and hanging the spine of the book off the edge to allow space for the hinge. I mark about 1/8 of an inch from the text block on the 3 other sides. Then cut the 2 cover boards off screen. Here I'm just test fitting the cover boards to make sure I measured everything correctly, and when I put it all together, there will still be space for the hinge and text block. Next, I found some paper and fabric that I'll be using to cover my boards. The fabric is book cloth, but the bag is a gift bag that I found at a thrift store. The bag has a really nice pattern on it, and I'm just playing around with the placement of the boards to decide what kind of pattern I want to be on my book. Now I'm flipping the paper over and drawing some guidelines for myself so that I know later when I put the cover boards on that everything is parallel. I glue the board out, put it on the paper, and flip everything over to get rid of any air bubbles with the teflon folder. Since I'm doing a style of binding called a quarter binding, I'll be covering both boards completely with paper now and then adding fabric to make up the spine. I leave myself about a ruler's width of paper on all sides. Then I trim the excess paper on the corners, brush glue onto the paper flaps, and fold them over. I like to fold over both of the long sides first before folding over both of the short sides, but there isn't a specific way to go about it, and it's really all the same in the end. After I'm done with the first cover, I set it aside and move on to the second cover. Everything in bookbinding is done at least 2 times, if not 4 times. So if you're learning how to bookbind, you can get a lot of practice in by just doing 1 or 2 books. Of course you won't become a master, but the learning curve for becoming proficient isn't too steep. After I've wrapped my covers in paper, I'll have 2 covers, but no spine to connect them. So we have to create a spine with book cloth. Here I'm laying the cloth and the covers out to make sure I have enough materials to wrap the book. The cloth is actually a little too wide, so I'll be trimming some off. I flip everything over and decide how much of the cloth I want to be glued to the covers. The proportion of fabric to paper is really an aesthetic preference, and I decide that I like it with about 1 inch of fabric covering the paper. I measure off 1 inch on the back side of the fabric, I put the glue where I've marked on the fabric, align the board down, flip everything over, and bone down to get rid of air bubbles. Next, I need to measure the width of fabric I need for the spine. To do this, I put my text block on my first cover, put the second cover on top of the text block, and then roll everything over on the fabric. I give it one last check to make sure it's all aligned, and then holding everything in place, I lift the top cover so that I can see where the second cover has fallen. I mark the spot with a pencil, extend the line with a ruler, and then measure 1 inch from that, which gives me the length of my fabric. Then I glue down the second cover, making sure to remove the air bubbles from the other side. I want to add a spine lining, so I find a piece of cardstock and use the text block to measure out the length and width of the spine. I cut it out and glue it down to the center of the fabric. Now I can glue down my fabric. I do this making sure I get into the corners created by the cover boards. And of course I have to do another test fitting. Everything's looking good and the text block fits into the covers, so I move on to add some end sheets. I want to use some pretty scrap paper for my end sheets, so I'm just deciding on what color scheme I want to go with. After I decide on the end sheets, I fold the papers and measure them to the size of the text block. Then I add a strip of glue to the folded edge of the paper and glue it down. I use the text block as a guide for cutting down the excess paper, then repeat the gluing and cutting on the other side of the book. With this, we're done with the text block. Nope, never mind, I wanted to add a ribbon. Voiceover me is so done with the me that made this book. I cut out the ribbon and thread it underneath the end band. I choose how much of the ribbon I want to stick out from the bottom of the book and glue the excess to the spine. Finally, we're ready to case in. Usually I line up the text block with the covers before I start gluing it out, but well, oops. I glue out my end sheets and then line it up with the cover. Then I press out the air bubbles with something soft like a napkin or some fabric. If I need a little extra help, I use a bone folder as well. Next, I glue down the other side, repeating the process. Once the text block is glued in the covers, I also bone down the hinges for extra strength. Lastly, I put my book under weight and let it sit overnight. And now it's done. This is the final product. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content.